The Pacific War wasn't supposed to be like this. When U.S. Marines first deployed to face Japanese forces in World War II, they carried with them the confidence of modern military training and superior industrial might. They expected battles that followed the established rules of engagement, where rational calculations of loss and gain determined outcomes. What they encountered instead shattered every assumption they held about warfare. The Japanese soldier represented something the American military had never confronted before, an adversary whose entire existence was shaped by a philosophy that made death preferable to dishonor. This wasn't propaganda or exaggeration. It was a tactical reality that transformed every engagement into a fight for survival. The Marines quickly learned that traditional Western military doctrine, built on the premise that soldiers would surrender when defeat became inevitable, simply didn't apply in the Pacific theater. Japanese soldiers fought with a ferocity that seemed to defy basic human self-preservation instincts. When American forces achieved what should have been decisive tactical victories, expecting enemy troops to raise white flags or retreat, they instead faced renewed attacks from soldiers who refused to acknowledge defeat. Wounded Japanese fighters would wait motionless among the dead, clutching grenades, ready to take Marines with them in final acts of defiance. Bunkers that had been cleared would suddenly erupt with gunfire from soldiers who had hidden in concealed compartments. Supply lines became death traps as stragglers conducted suicide missions rather than face capture. The psychological impact on Marine units was profound and immediate. Every corpse became a potential threat. Every quiet moment carried the tension of imminent violence. Sleep became a luxury measured in minutes rather than hours. The jungle itself seemed to conspire against them, with its oppressive heat, disease-carrying insects, and terrain that negated many American technological advantages. But it was the human element that truly tested their resolve. Japanese night infiltration tactics exploited the Marines' most primal fears. Under cover of darkness, enemy soldiers would silently penetrate American defensive perimeters. They moved with supernatural stealth through dense vegetation, sometimes taking hours to advance mere yards. The goal wasn't always to inflict maximum casualties but to create psychological havoc. A single scream in the night could send entire units into panicked firing, revealing positions and wasting ammunition. Marines would find sentries dead at their posts in the morning, throats cut without anyone hearing a sound. These night raids forced American troops into a state of constant hypervigilance that ground down their mental resilience. The Japanese understood that exhausted, terrified soldiers made mistakes. And mistakes in the Pacific were almost always fatal. Banzai charges represented another dimension of this psychological warfare. When Western military forces found themselves in hopeless tactical situations, doctrine called for organized retreat or surrender to preserve lives for future operations. Japanese commanders instead ordered full-scale frontal assaults. Hundreds of soldiers would emerge screaming from the jungle, bayonets fixed, charging directly into American machine gun fire. The rational mind expected these attacks to falter as casualties mounted. They didn't. Wave after wave continued until literally every attacker lay dead or the Marine positions were overrun. For the Marines manning defensive lines, the experience was nightmarish. The sound alone was designed to terrorize, hundreds of voices screaming battle cries, accompanied by officers waving swords and blowing whistles. Even as machine guns cut down entire ranks, the survivors kept coming. Marines found themselves firing until barrels glowed red, until ammunition ran low, until Japanese soldiers were climbing over the bodies of their comrades to reach American foxholes. The hand-to-hand combat that followed was savage beyond description. These weren't the clean engagements of training exercises. They were desperate struggles in mud and blood, where men fought with bayonets, knives, entrenching tools, fists, and teeth. The Japanese soldiers' training in close combat was extensive and brutal. They practiced bayonet techniques until the movements became reflexive. Their smaller stature often worked to their advantage in the confined spaces of jungle warfare. Marines who survived these encounters carried physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives. The refusal to surrender created impossible ethical and tactical dilemmas. In European theaters, wounded enemy soldiers could be bypassed or taken prisoner. In the Pacific, wounded Japanese fighters remained threats until confirmed dead. This forced Marines into actions that violated their moral sensibilities but were necessary for survival. The concept of playing dead took on sinister dimensions. Japanese soldiers would feign death or severe injury, waiting for American medics or curious Marines to approach before detonating grenades or opening fire. This tactic poisoned the natural human impulse toward mercy. Marines learned to shoot every body, to throw grenades into every bunker multiple times, to trust nothing. The transformation this wrought in young American soldiers was profound. Men who had been raised with certain values about fair play and honor found themselves operating under entirely different rules. The psychological cost was immense, but the alternative was death. Japanese defensive tactics amplified these challenges exponentially. When forced into defensive positions, Japanese forces created elaborate networks of caves, tunnels, and fortified bunkers. These positions were engineered with interlocking fields of fire and concealed approaches. A single cave system might house dozens of soldiers with weeks of supplies. Clearing these positions required Marines to assault fortified points where defenders held every advantage. The Japanese would allow attacking forces to advance into kill zones before opening fire from multiple concealed positions simultaneously. Even when individual strongpoints were neutralized, interconnecting tunnels allowed defenders to reoccupy positions or attack from unexpected angles. Flamethrowers became essential weapons not out of cruelty but necessity. Grenades and small arms fire often couldn't reach defenders deep in cave systems. The psychological burden of using such weapons weighed heavily on the Marines who operated them, but the alternative was accepting catastrophic casualties from conventional assaults. Booby traps added another layer of constant danger. Japanese forces demonstrated remarkable ingenuity in creating deadly surprises from limited materials. Grenades were rigged to detonate when bodies were moved. Tripwires were strung across trails at ankle height, connected to artillery shells or mines. Abandoned equipment was wired to explode when touched. Even seemingly safe areas like captured Japanese positions had to be meticulously searched. Wells might be poisoned. Food supplies could be contaminated. Weapons left behind might be sabotaged to malfunction catastrophically. The Marines learned to trust nothing, touch nothing, assume nothing. This constant vigilance was mentally exhausting. Every step required conscious evaluation. Every object demanded scrutiny. The cognitive load of maintaining this level of awareness, combined with the physical demands of combat and the tropical environment, pushed men to their breaking points. Combat fatigue, what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, affected Marines at alarming rates. The Japanese exploitation of terrain demonstrated tactical sophistication that caught American forces off guard. In jungle environments, visibility often measured in yards rather than hundreds of yards. This negated American advantages in artillery and air support. Japanese forces would position themselves so close to Marine lines that calling in fire support risked friendly casualties. They understood that Americans valued their soldiers' lives and exploited this humanitarian impulse. Ambush tactics were refined to brutal efficiency. Japanese units would allow Marine patrols to pass, then attack from behind, cutting off retreat routes. They positioned forces on high ground overlooking trails, creating killing fields where American troops were exposed and vulnerable. The Marines' superior firepower meant little when they couldn't identify targets until too late. Snipers represented a particularly insidious threat. Japanese marksmen would tie themselves into treetops, creating positions that were nearly impossible to spot. They demonstrated extraordinary patience, sometimes waiting days for high-value targets. A single sniper could pin down entire units, forcing Marines to advance with agonizing slowness, never knowing which tree concealed death. The psychological impact of sniper fire exceeded its tactical effect. The randomness of it, the way a man could be talking one moment and dead the next, wore down unit cohesion. Marines became reluctant to move, to expose themselves, to take necessary tactical risks. Japanese commanders understood they couldn't match American industrial capacity or firepower. Their strategy instead focused on making every American victory so costly that public support for the war would erode. They calculated that Americans, comfortable and distant from existential threats, lacked the will for prolonged sacrifice. This strategy nearly worked. Casualty rates in Pacific Island campaigns shocked the American public. Places like Tarawa, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa became synonymous with unprecedented losses. The Japanese succeeded in making the Marines pay in blood for every yard of ground. But they miscalculated the American response. Rather than breaking Marine morale, the Japanese tactics forged a harder, more ruthless fighting force. The Marines adapted, developing new tactics specifically for Pacific combat. They learned to use combined arms more effectively, coordinating infantry, armor, artillery, and air support in ways that minimized exposure to Japanese strengths. Flamethrower tanks became standard for bunker assaults. Close air support evolved into a precision tool. Artillery tactics adapted to jungle conditions. Intelligence gathering improved as Marines learned to identify Japanese defensive patterns. But perhaps most importantly, the Marines developed a psychological resilience that matched their adversaries' determination. They learned to function despite fear, to push forward despite exhaustion, to maintain discipline when every instinct screamed to flee or freeze. This transformation came at terrible cost. The young men who fought in the Pacific were forever changed by what they experienced and what they were forced to do. Many carried guilt and trauma for decades afterward. The brutality of Pacific combat created moral injuries that no medal could heal. Yet their adaptation and ultimate victory demonstrated that American forces could match any enemy's determination when circumstances demanded it. The Japanese soldiers' refusal to surrender stemmed from cultural conditioning that began in childhood. The concept of Bushido, the warrior code, was systematically instilled through education and military training. Surrender was portrayed not merely as defeat but as ultimate shame that extended to family and ancestors. This indoctrination was so complete that even when facing certain death, Japanese soldiers genuinely believed fighting to the end was the only honorable choice. The Marines initially struggled to comprehend this mindset. American military culture acknowledged courage but also recognized the pragmatic value of living to fight another day. The idea that death was preferable to capture seemed irrational, even insane. But it was neither. It was the logical outcome of a completely different philosophical framework about duty, honor, and the individual's relationship to the collective. Understanding this didn't make fighting Japanese forces easier, but it helped Marines anticipate enemy behavior. They learned that surrounded Japanese units wouldn't negotiate. That offering quarter was pointless. That every engagement would continue until one side was completely destroyed. This knowledge was terrible but necessary. The fear Marines felt toward Japanese soldiers was ultimately rational. It wasn't based on racial prejudice or propaganda, though both existed. It was rooted in a concrete reality that they faced an enemy who fought by completely different rules. An enemy who turned conventional military wisdom on its head. An enemy who weaponized death itself. The Pacific War forced American military doctrine to evolve. The lessons learned in those brutal campaigns influenced training, tactics, and strategic thinking for generations. The Marines who survived became the teachers of new generations, passing on hard-won knowledge about adapting to any enemy, no matter how unconventional their methods. The fear was real, justified, and ultimately overcome through adaptation, determination, and sacrifice that should never be forgotten.